people who were getting those subprime loans qualified for A loans. And I think it's a worthy point that too often, especially when there are exhortations to do more to make credit available to people of color, people find these ways to cut corners and make bad loans to people and exploit people and extract it again. And some of that, I think, goes to Debbie's point about notions of who's worthy and just these notions that they can't make good loans in certain areas, and so they peddle bad loans rather than dealing with people individually. In terms of enforcement and where we are today, let me just say that I think the #1 challenge we have is that we have a very strong law that isn't well enforced. And I say that as someone who spent many years in the federal government, and the biggest struggle, one, is the resources to enforce the law. But then also, I think the nature of government bureaucracy too, to sort of approach some of this stuff passively. The great thing about the Fair Housing Act is anyone who faces discrimination can file a complaint of discrimination and have it investigated and enforced by the federal government. But I think one of the biggest problems is the way in which discrimination occurs, most people don't recognize as discrimination, right? And so there was a big expose a few years ago in Newsday that showed the housing discrimination by real estate agents out on Long Island. And in that expose, it was testers who went out, pretending to be looking for property, and they presented themselves with equal qualifications, but a black tester would go out and a white tester would go out, or a Hispanic tester would go out and a white tester would go out, Asian and a white. And for the most part, the testers believed they were treated fine, but they didn't see how the other pair in the test was treated. And so when this was caught on camera, it was all filmed, it exposed that white testers were treated a lot better and told about more houses than the black testers. And even were told, the white testers were told, don't live in certain areas because there are black people there, or because you want to live in this school district. School districts came up frequently. And so, when the African American and Hispanic and Asian testers saw, the footage and how the whites were treated better, they cried. But that wasn't their experience, so they would never have reported it. And so at the National Association of Realtors, I point out, we can always tell people, hey, if you experience discrimination, go report it, but that's not going to lead to very much if people don't know, right? And it has a real effect, because you have people out there steering. And so I've emphasized that it's the federal government and the state and local governments who often have the authority to do this kind of testing and to bring cases on their own who need to expose this. And so as taxpayers, people need to demand that of their government. You're paying for taxes to agencies to enforce the law. It's good that they're investigating individual complaints, but the nature of discrimination in 2023 is not going to yield those complaints. But if you go out there and you do some testing, these are the kinds of practices you're going to see. The one other thing I want to point out is that, and maybe we're going to talk more about this, but the other challenge we have is, even if we eliminate the discrimination that still occurs, that goes underreported, this history that we've talked about has a self-perpetuating effect, right? And it's recent history, right? So not being able to take advantage of the GI Bill, move into certain communities and see your property appraised as others did, has had intergenerational effects. And so when we talk about credit, if you couldn't buy a home, or the home that your family bought didn't appraise as high, you have less wealth. And you go into situations where everything costs the same. a Toyota costs the same for me as it costs for you, but if you have less money, that's going to affect your credit, right? And so all of these different factors, which has resulted in less wealth, are going to have impacts. And a fine example, if you want to get higher education, if, you know, many people pull the equity from their homes in order to send their children to school. And so we see this today when we're looking at home ownership statistics, that African Americans who are trying to buy homes, you know, are taking out student loans in order to go to college, go to graduate school, to get the income to compensate for the lack of family wealth. And so now they have all the student loan debt because there was no other help. And so they're finding ways to get the income to pay for the home, but they're also saddled with more debt. And so African Americans have twice as much or twice as likely to have student loan debt, and significantly more than whites, again because of this history. When we looked at successful home buyers, we also found that African Americans were 3 times as likely, and Hispanics 2 times as likely, to dip into their retirement in order to find the down payment for a home, whereas whites were twice as likely to have the income, the proceeds from the sale of a home in order to find their down payment. So all of this has intergenerational effects, not to mention the fact that if you buy a home and you live in a certain neighborhood, it may not be appraised as high as people in another neighborhood, meaning then you don't have that equity that others have to tap, or you don't have that wealth to pass on. There's more I want to say. I'm going to hold it for my next.
Sure, there's so much to discuss.
Yeah.
Deborah, did you want to chime in?
Yes, please. Oh no, I have nothing to say.